All right. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steve Wilson from the State Water Survey at the University of Illinois, and I am leading the discussion today on what realtors need to know about homes with water well, which would be water wells. Okay, so I want to mention that the private well class, which this is all based on, is the work we've done to develop this 10-lesson class, which I'll talk about at the end, is funded through US EPA by the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, which is a national technical assistance and training organization that works with both private well owners as well as small communities in water and wastewater infrastructure and issues related to their water system. So we're partners with RCAP. They're a great organization to work with, and they have staff in every state, and many of them are working on a private well program where they could actually do some boots on the ground work around the country. And so if you have issues, they're one of the providers who could give you some advice and maybe look at your situation. And so I want to mention that. Okay, there we go. So a little bit about today's webinar. Again, it's a national program through RCAP. We try to follow our private well class materials. There's more here because this is directed towards realtors today. And so there'll be some things that are more our observations and best practices and things that we feel realtors need to understand and know about private wells and private well owners as well. So we are recording this webinar and record every one of them, and you can get to those on our YouTube page or on the video section of the privatewellclass.org webpage. There were many questions asked whenever you all signed up for the webinar. And we'll answer as many of those as we can, and they're at the end here. But then while you're on the webinar today, if you have any questions, you please put those in the question box or the chat box that's on your GoToWebinar screen or little pop-up. And Katie Buckley, is following up with those, and we'll go over those at the end. She's going to track all the questions, and we'll go over those. So, yeah. I'm Steve Wilson. I'm a groundwater hydrologist. I work at the State Water Survey, and in Illinois, we're the only state with a state water survey. It's similar to a state geological survey. We do applied research and public service for the residents of Illinois. We house the state's well log. We have a public service lab, which Dan, our manager of the public service lab, is on the call today. And we offer sampling for private well owners, and until 2008, I believe, that was actually free to any well owner for inorganics and metals in Illinois. Also today is Katie Buckley, who's with our outreach program for the private well class here at the Water Survey, and she's taking your questions that you put in the chat box or the question box and putting those in a Google Doc that at the end we'll pull that over and go through. So yeah, if you have any questions, if your question doesn't come up as we go through this and you asked a question, you can ask it again in the chat box, but because there were literally probably close to 100 questions, and we'll probably answer about 15 of those today or 20 as we have time. So about today, issues that are important to home buyers, what we're going to talk about is those things as well as construction basics. As a realtor, you should really understand if someone says, oh, I have a sand and gravel well versus I have a bedrock well versus I have an old hand dug or a bored well. Those things matter on water quality, risk, vulnerability, and all that sort of stuff. And then some basic water quality ideas, how to find information for your client, that sort of thing. And then at the end, we'll go through a bunch of the questions. So, and this particular well is in a floodplain. So they did what I consider a really smart thing. They put the casing 10 feet above land surface, so that even if the creek that's behind this well were to flood the area there, the water would not get up to the top of the well and potentially contaminate it, at least through the well cap. And assuming the annulus around the well is sealed properly, this well would be protected during a flooding event, which is just an interesting and really good idea. So things to remember as a private well owner, in most areas they're not regulated at all. There's a few counties where there are regulations, and we're seeing more and more areas, local health districts, who may be creating some regulations related to private wells, but it's really 98% of the country. It's really up to the well owner. Once a well's been installed properly and meets a state code, if there is one, and the water's passed an initial test when the well's first built, then after that there's no requirements for further testing or to ensure the water meets some kind of water quality standard, unless in some cases when it's sold, there are laws been put in place. But the thing to remember is many of the things that might be contaminants are also colorless, odorless, and tasteless. So you can't go by, oh, this water tastes great and it's clear. That doesn't mean it necessarily doesn't have anything in it. The only way to be sure is to test. And in many cases, well water is fine and meets what would be considered water quality standards. As a surrogate, most states and most jurisdictions use the EPA's public drinking water system standards. For instance, the arsenic standard for a community water supply is 10, and that's generally what's considered safe, and that's kind of a surrogate that most folks use than for arsenic for a private well. And I grew up on an old hand-dug well that my grandpa hand-dug in 1933, but now I live in the Champaign-Urbana area on a community water supply, and I pay $40, $50 a month for my water through Illinois American Water, and that's the cost spread out over all the residents for sampling, maintenance, infrastructure, so that when I turn on my tap in my kitchen, I have water pressure and I have water that comes out and it's safe to drink and it's been tested and I know it doesn't have anything in it. As a well owner, they're responsible for all of those things. Pump goes out, pipes freeze, there's a lot of things to being a well owner, and I bring that up because really what our class is about, the free class that I'll mention at the end, is really meant to teach well owners how important it is to be a good steward of their well and to understand their responsibilities. So, and again, everything we do for our class, we've developed videos, and we even held a conference in May, is all free because it's funded by tax dollars through US EPA. So it's free information for you all and any well owner and others around the country. So your client may not understand about their well, what it means if it's poor construction or poor water quality. What we find is, there's all these issues that come up like Flint, Michigan and lead, or the flooding and the hurricanes down in Texas. But those are very public events that cause an increase in interest in a well, based on whatever happened, that water quality problem. But the majority of contaminant problems in private wells are because of old or poor construction. And so understanding that, and that the well may be 40 or 50 years old and put in prior to existing standards, is important to understand what kind of situation they might be in. So as a seller, you're better off understanding that up front and repairing or adding treatment. If naturally occurring arsenic is another example, you should go ahead and add treatment before you try to sell the house, because what we recommend to buyers is it's buyer beware. And I'm going to say that a number of times today, but if you want to protect your public health and you want to ensure that the well and the house you're buying has a potable water supply, you have to test it first. And I tell well owners, you should never buy a house that you haven't personally had it tested, or that they've tested and provided you the results, because it does affect property values, as well as what it's going to cost to live there if you're adding treatment and you have to change out maintenance equipment on a treatment system, those sorts of things. But the bottom line is it's about health protection. So again, take our class. It'll help you understand all those issues. We go through all of that in more detail there. So our take is, whether you represent the buyer or the seller, you should do an inspection of the well and the water system. The drinking water should be tested, and you really should inform your client and be informed yourself so that you can answer questions that you might get from either a buyer or a seller about a well. And the more you know, the more intelligent you sound, the more engaged you are, and those issues are important, especially if you sell a lot of homes in areas where there are private wells. So quickly, we're going to go through a little 101, well 101, if you will. There's really three types of wells, and the first type are dug or bored wells. And these are generally large diameter, meaning usually greater than 24 inches. Sometimes we've run across wells that are 10 foot wide. What usually happens is they use concrete tile. This is a boring machine for drilling a bored out well, and you can see the size of that bucket. It's about a 3 foot diameter, and they'll put concrete tile down in that hole vertically, and it's in the seams between the 4 foot sections of tile where water seeps in. And typically you put in a large diameter well like this because there is no real aquifer to pull water from. If you had a good sand and gravel aquifer, a bedrock aquifer here, you'd drill a well and it would pull water from the aquifer. But when there isn't that, a lot of times you put in these dug or bored large diameter wells so that water can seep in from the water table. By itself, that means that it's water at the upper surface of where the saturated soil is. That could be at 5 feet, it could be at 15 feet, it could be at 2 feet. So it's water that has more influence from the surface. So typically these sorts of wells, we see more contaminants than in deeper wells that are drilled and they're pulling their water from a deeper source. These are 3 examples of dug and bored wells. All 3 of these are, greater than 3 foot diameter. The one at the top left is an old hand dug well. You can see here it's on a slope in a pasture. There's a cornfield above, a gradient up above, which means there's probably been pesticides and nitrates applied. Those posts are so worn because there's cattle in that pasture, and they come up and rub on those posts to scratch. It's covered with 2x10s and then some tin and then some concrete blocks to hold it all down. Snakes, rodents, spiders, everything else can get in that. And so that well, it would be amazing to me if that well didn't have coliform problems all the time. And you can see even on the lower right how it looks like there's some mud there, and that's where the cattle, it's been raining or whatever, and they've been there enough that they've made that kind of a little mud spot. So all that's infiltrating in, it's coming in shallow. We still see a lot of hand dug wells that are very poorly constructed and not protected well at the surface. The one on the right is a concrete tile 3 foot diameter well that has a concrete cap. If you assume that that's a 4 foot section of concrete tile that's sticking about a foot out of the ground, that means the first seam is down at 3 feet. Now, if this is concreted around the well down to 10 or 15 feet, then that's not an issue. But if it's not, then that means water can seep in at 3 feet. So anytime you apply anything to the yard or anything spills in the yard or whatever, it's going to seep through the soil and can get down into your well. And the one on the lower left is also a 3 foot diameter well. It's just the upper 10 feet is a 6-inch steel casing, and the actual large diameter part of the well doesn't start until further below. So it looks like a normal drilled well that might be sand and gravel or bedrock, but in fact this is a bored well. I took that picture, so I know it is. So here's those 2 examples. The one on the right that was a concrete tile to the surface is the picture on the left here, and you can see they show the best practices for this is to put concrete in the upper 10 feet or a minimum of 10 feet so that water can't seep in from the surface and it can't get into that well until it gets at least 10 feet below land surface. The one on the right is the picture that was on the lower left on the other side. At the top it looks like a regular 6-inch diameter well, but when you get down to 10 feet or below, then the large casings part of that starts. And again, this is an area where there's really no aquifer, and it shows in the picture here that there's some sand lenses in the soil, but it's mostly fine textured soil, clay and silt, and so those sand lenses may hold a little water, but it's water seeping through the clay and silt that gets into the well. And the whole point of a large diameter well is to create, it's almost like a cistern. It's meant to store water so that it can seep in slowly, and then as you use water in your house, it may drop the water level down, but then overnight it refills, and it's because there's not an adequate water supply. Like you couldn't pump this at 20 gallons a minute for a day. You'd run out of water. And our well where I grew up on was 14 foot deep. It was hand dug, and it was lined with brick, uncemented brick, so water could seep in between all the bricks. In the summer, if I left a hose in our horse tank and forgot about it, we might be without water for 2 or 3 days. and that's how long it took for that to fill back in. So it's an issue, and it really just means that there's not a good aquifer there, and that's why you have a large diameter well like that in most cases. Okay, sand and gravel well, just like it sounds like, these are wells that are finished in a sand and gravel aquifer. So this is a well screen that you're looking at. It's woven with stainless steel. With those slots are a specific size, depending on the size of the sand. So if you're in if the sand grains are larger, more like gravel, then the space between those could be larger. But when you get into finer sands, then those spaces need to be pretty tiny. And the idea is the screen keeps the sand out but lets the water in. A typical sand and gravel well is made out of PVC or steel with a stainless steel screen. Sometimes you see other types of screen as well, but the screen's at the bottom. And so again, the screen size is based on the sand size in the formation. So typically a driller will have a number of different screen slot sizes on hand, and when they drill the well, they're pulling samples, and if it's finer sand, they're using a smaller screen, and if it's larger sand grains, then they're using a larger screen. And then you also put gravel around that to help act as a filter for the finer sand to not get in the well. So here's a diagram of what a typical sand and gravel well looks like. And you can see the screens at the bottom. So that's really important. This well, let's say it's 200 feet deep. A typical well screen on a 5 or 6 inch well for a domestic household well will be 4 to 10 feet or less. So if this is a 200-foot well, that means the screen's down at 190 or maybe even 196 to 200 feet below land surface. So that means that's the only place that water can get in that well. It's a solid casing other than that. So that's very protected from the surface as long as the annulus around the well hole, around the casing where the well hole is drilled, is sealed properly with clay or bentonite or concrete. Then the only place water is getting in that well is 196 feet down, as I mentioned. So you can see the pieces here. There's a screen, usually a submersible pump. This is actually a poor diagram in the sense that you don't put the pump down in the screen because that causes faster velocities and can lead to sand getting in your well. Typically it's up above somewhere. Most aquifers, the water level rises above the level of the screen. It's either at the top of the aquifer or it's even higher if it's under pressure. So then if you're in a cold climate, you have a pitless adapter, and a pitless is basically a unit that allows the vertical pipe coming up from your pump to turn 90 degrees and go to your house at a depth that keeps it from freezing. So in the old days, before the invention of the pitless adapter, wells were always in pits. These small pits where you ended the well 4 feet below land surface and the pipe came out of the top, and then it turned and went to the house, and that was so that you're below the frost line. Pits are dangerous. They're a safety hazard. They can flood and fill up with water, so if your cap isn't tight, they can cause water to leak into your well. Insects and other things can be in there. So they invented this pitless adapter that is a device that basically does that for you, and it slips off so that you can pull the pump when you need to. And this eliminates the need to have a pit, which is the big advantage here. So, yeah. A sand and gravel well versus a bedrock well. So very similar in that, let's say this is a 200-foot well. The well goes down 200 feet into bedrock, but the casing doesn't go all the way down. So most bedrock wells, you only have casing down into the rock. So in this example, let's say the overburden, here it says overburden and saturated overburden are the sand, gravel, clay, silt, probably mostly clay and silt because there's not a lot of aquifer up there. You put a well in it, and then you hit bedrock. So this casing is seated, it shows here, 10 to 20 feet of casing into bedrock, and then after that the casing stops. Rock is hard enough and solid enough that it doesn't need a casing. So basically it's an open hole below that. You keep drilling down, and this casing could be a total of 30 feet below land surface, or it could be 130 feet below land surface, depending on where the bedrock is, but then below that's the open hole. And the reason you do it that way is because of those blue angled lines are actually fractures in the rock, and that's where the water is. So most rock is solid enough that it really doesn't hold a lot of water in its own, in the rock matrix. Like you can't squeeze a rock and get water out of it, right? But the fractures that exist in bedrock, and depending on the type of rock, there's a lot of fractures, are what the water flows through, almost like a conduit system or a piping system. So you want your well to hit some of those fractures. And when it does, then you have enough water. And if for some reason you didn't hit any fractures, you may only have a well that produces a quarter gallon a minute or less, which isn't very useful. So the disadvantage of a bedrock well, there's two. One is those fractures could go a long way away from your well, and if you only have one or two, all the water's coming from those fractures. So like these fractures are angled up towards the surface. That could mean that the water in your well, even though the fractures at 180 feet or whatever, it could be connected to fractures that go up towards the surface where there may be more surface influence. And the other issue is the amount of casing. So I mentioned earlier a sand and gravel well gets its water from, say, 196 to 200 where the screen is. A 200-foot bedrock well could get its water from anywhere that's not cased. So if that casing only went in 10 feet into bedrock, but bedrock was 10 feet below land surface, then you only have 20 feet of total casing. It means anywhere below 20 feet, water can get in the well. And so that's a lot less protection from surface influence than, a sand and gravel well where it might be 100 and some odd feet. So it's a really important thing to understand that water in a bedrock well could be coming from much further away than it typically would be for a sand and gravel well. And the problem is you just don't have sand and gravel aquifers everywhere. And in many cases, you don't have a choice. So well type certainly matters. It's usually based on the geology. That's what determines what type of well you may have. In some cases, you may have more than one option. You may have a sand and gravel aquifer sitting on top of a bedrock aquifer. And depending on the water quality, you may choose to use one or the other. Typically, you don't put in a dug or bored well unless there just is no other aquifer, or if it happens to be a property with a very old well and that was hand dug back in the day, like the one I grew up on. So understanding those differences and what kind of well it is, not just knowing it's a 300-foot well, but is it a 300-foot bedrock well, then how much casing is there? And a good example of that's in New York. I worked out there a couple summers ago with some of the RCAP folks, and when I went to look at the well logs they have on file with their state, there were many that might be 300-foot wells because the water level's so low in that area, but they only have 20 or 30 feet of casing. So, matter of fact, several were only 12-foot, 15-foot, or even 8-foot, which isn't legal now, but it was when they were drilled. So if you only have 8 feet of pipe before the well becomes an open hole, it means anything can run in from 8 feet on down. So it makes a big difference. And that's why logs are so important. You should do your due diligence and try to find a well log for a property if it's going to go on the market or whatever, so you can understand those things and what kind of risks either the seller might have when they buy the property, or the buyer, excuse me. So as I said earlier, many of these issues are because of poor construction, and construction codes have changed over the last 30 or so years. Illinois passed a law in 1968 requiring wells meet code and also requiring logs to be filed, but any wells that were in existence before that were not required to meet the new code. Some states like New York, they didn't pass that law until 2000. So one, they don't have very many well logs on file because most of them were drilled before 2000, and two, they have no idea where they're all at and how they were constructed. So, and again, these poorly constructed wells, especially if they have a pit, are both an opportunity for surface contamination and they're a safety hazard. And I'll just show you two examples. The one on the left is from Washington State Department of Ecology. They have a blog where they're the regulatory agency in Washington State for well construction and drillers. And this woman stepped on this piece of plywood that's been covering her well probably forever, and it broke and she fell and it killed her. You can see this well. It's a corrugated pipe, like a tile under a road. But you can see insulation up there along the wall, and there's an old funnel there and a broom. Stuff was getting in that well anyway. It's not properly protected. It's a bad situation, and to think that people are drinking that water. Sometimes when people think their water tastes funny, you find amazing things down in an old dug well, especially. The one on the right, that's a goat. And there's nothing else to say there, but clearly if a goat can get in a well, it's not very well protected at the surface. So when you work in this field, you see all kinds of crazy things. You think there's no way it's possible, but they are, and they do happen. So what should you do? Bring this up to code, find out what the code is in your state, and make sure they're safe and that they're protected at the surface so that there isn't a surface influence. If the well's down in a pit, extend the pipe up to the surface, fill it in, and then talk to your county or your local health district, a contractor, find out what they recommend to make it safe before you try to do anything with that kind of property. Same thing with abandoned wells. So because well logs weren't required for a long time, there are many, many wells that we have no idea are even out there because they're undocumented. So like wells and pits, they're a safety hazard. As a matter of fact, both those examples could be wells that, especially the one with the goat could be you might have that in an abandoned well. We've all seen stories where there's an old well on a property somewhere and somebody fell in it. Even in movies, you see that sometimes where the well, somebody fell into it or whatever. But if it's on your property and you have one, if you don't seal it and fill it in, or on your customer's property, it leaves you responsible. Someone falls in and gets hurt or it contaminates an aquifer, the owner of the property is going to be liable. And so I know some states have disclosures for any other wells on a property or abandoned wells, but not everybody does. That doesn't mean that they necessarily have to do anything about it. I believe in some states they may, but the rules are so different everywhere. It really is the best thing to do is to take it upon yourself to make sure that the property is safe and things like an abandoned well are sealed before it changes hands. Here's just some examples. There's a horse in a well. Another picture from the Washington State Department of Ecology on the bottom there. This guy was really lucky. He fell 45 feet into this well and he didn't get hurt. It just took him a while to get him out. So, and the newspaper clippings on the right here are all from, 3 of them are from Illinois. The third one is actually Jessica McClure, the little girl that was trapped in a well in Texas back in the late 90s. And those of you old enough to remember that was covered live on CNN for like 18 hours when they rescued her. But these other 3 are all from Illinois, and they're all from regional papers. Springfield, which is our state capital, Buffalo Grove, which is Chicago suburb, and Galesburg, which is in western Illinois. And, these are all from the 90s. But I guarantee you that the folks in Springfield didn't know that happened in Buffalo Grove or in Galesburg. It just didn't make national news. We didn't have media like we have today. A lot more of this goes on than people realize. And so, they're really a risk, and there's a lot of them out there. In some states, there's probably close to 1 million old wells that aren't being used that haven't been properly abandoned. And we find them one by one, or when somebody finds a well. We just did a project working with a groundwater guardian group out of Macomb, Illinois, where Western Illinois University is, and worked with the local health department there. Someone found an old dug well on their property in Macomb, which is a town of about 15,000 people. They've had public water since 1916, so the well hasn't been used forever, but they just found it, and it's right outside their back door, and they're 4 blocks from downtown. So they're right in the heart of the town, and they've got a dug well on their property. So there's a lot of them. Okay, so whether, this is kind of a theme here, whether you represent the buyer or the seller, you should do an inspection of the well and the water system. And from the seller standpoint, it's better to be prepared, make corrections beforehand, because if, as well owners become more knowledgeable, and it's because as some of the folks who are funding loans like HUD and stuff become more aware of these issues, they're starting to require more. And so, testing is becoming more important. And if it needs treatment, like if, there's treatment for arsenic. So if you have naturally occurring arsenic, you just need to add treatment, whether that's RO or some kind of filter. But it's better to make informed decisions. And again, from the buyer side, as I said before, we tell everyone, you need to protect yourself. If the health department only requires coliform and nitrate sampling, you need to go ahead and spend the dollars to go ahead and have the rest of a lot of other things tested for, or you regret it. And the best example of that is someone here in Illinois where the county health department, they only tested for coliform and nitrate. They bought the property. About 2 years later, she called me, mad and wanting to know why the state didn't do more to protect her. She's got 3 kids, and she tested their water, and she has arsenic at 150 ppb. And I explained to her that, that would require the state legislature to pass a law that's probably not going to happen because there's more people in the state that want to take care of that themselves rather than have the state tell them they have to. But, they've been drinking that for the last couple of years, and now she's going to add treatment and all that stuff. But you need to take care of that on your ahead of time. And I'd say for anyone you represent that's a buyer, I'd make sure that that's done before I'd let them buy a property. Because if they find out later, it can affect property values as well. And like I said, yeah, it's buyer beware. So this is from the state of Wisconsin. And I show this example because Wisconsin actually does this, I think, the smart way. They have this form, the Department of Natural Resources, which is the regulatory agency for wells up there and well drillers. If you're going to, here's what they do. They say, you don't have to have your well inspected, but if you're going to have it inspected, you're required by law to use a well contractor who can inspect it properly, and you're also required to fill out this form. They don't want the form. They want you to make sure you provide it to the folks involved in the transaction. So they're saying, we want to make sure that this is done right and that we're protecting the rights of the folks buying and selling the property. So if someone requires a inspection or wants one, this is how they have to do it. And what they basically do is they compare the well to the existing Wisconsin well code. And so it just tells you, maybe it's something simple like, their code may say a well has to be at least 12 inches above grade. So 12 inches above land surface. Maybe it's only 8, so that would be something they would mark. Not that that means the well's bad by any means, but it's just, they're comparing it to the code to say, here's what we say safe, and here's what you're getting into. So, and you can see here all the different things that they check off, and they want you to be able to, as a licensed well driller or pump installer, you have to sign this. You're bound legally, and it means that what the folks in the transaction are getting is good advice. So, and why do that? Most states have well construction code, and there's setback requirements for not just septic, but all these things. I'm using Minnesota's because this is a great example. They show all the setback distances whenever you're putting in a new well and what's required. And, some of these things you may not have realized are important, especially like from a building. Why do you need to be at least 3 feet from a building or overhang? So that the drill rig can get in to pull the pump or do whatever. I've come across wells that are in basements, that are under garages with concrete pad over top of them. There's no way to access that well ever, right? And so all these things matter, and they're meant to be a way to, and so that well that's under the garage, the concrete pad for the garage, there's no way to ever even seal that well without tearing the concrete out. So they're all for a reason. They're all meant to protect public health and the water quality in the well. And this is just the rest of that form, or I might have just accidentally put it in there twice. I apologize. So, okay, so the next thing, so test the water. As I've probably already mentioned this, but if you're going to need treatment, you want to know in advance. It can actually be a selling point. So it makes the seller look more honest, and like they're not trying to hide anything, and that they're trying to take care of things, and that sort of thing. And from the buyer's perspective, again, is protect yourself, because one, it affects property values, and it could affect your health. Do a test for chlorine. I know folks who have had their well chlorinated and then done a test so they could sell the property, knowing that there's a It's an old well that's frequently contaminated with coliform, and it's really skirting the issue. In that case, where you have a well that is going to have a problem with coliform bacteria, it needs to have continuous chlorination. There needs to be treatment added, not trying to pass the test so the property can be sold. So why this is important? I guess I already told the example about the arsenic concern. Oh, actually, no, I haven't. I told the second one. Buyer beware. Why doesn't the state do more to protect me and my family? That's the woman who called me that had 150 ppb of arsenic. This other one, though, I don't want to know. I know someone asked that question. How do we deal with people who don't want to know or don't want to get testing to find out, and that sort of stuff? Well, in Illinois, there's a law that says you have to fill out this form. Yes or no, I know of issues with my well or my septic. And we were doing an arsenic research study in a rural area where we were sampling private wells for arsenic to try to look at the variability of arsenic in an aquifer. And I had a guy who told me, you can sample my well as long as you do it when I'm not home and you don't send me the results. And I was like, why would you want me to do that? And he said, because I'm trying to sell my property and I want to be able to honestly fill out that form and say I don't know of anything wrong with my well. I think that's doing things the wrong way. And especially as a realtor, I would want my realtor to have my back, because it could come back to litigation down the road. In Illinois, you have to prove that they knew about it, and this guy could probably honestly say he didn't. But given that there's arsenic in the area and some other things, you're just opening yourself up to some issues. So what to test for, it is different in every situation. But there's a general set of things that, most of the time cover all those things. I would ask your county or state health department or, local health department if your counties don't have health departments, and ask them for advice. But there's a, core set of things that I'll show you in a second. Find out. Talk to your extension agent, your neighbor, your driller, your state agency, health department. Is there anything in your area? I guarantee you, like in Illinois, in Tazewell County, there's a lot of arsenic in the Mahomet Aquifer there. And so if you called the health department there, their environmental health group would say, yeah, you should test for arsenic, just to be sure. And we find, wide ranges of arsenic values there, but some of them are pretty high. So, and again, the other thing is your lender might have requirements, but those are even an issue. And I'll talk about that in the questions section because, they're very different wherever you are. And in some cases, they're less restrictive or more restrictive. And so, everyone's not being treated equally is what it comes down to. So for natural groundwater quality, it's really easy to find out, honestly. There's a few places to call, a state DNR or Department of Environmental Quality, or, in Illinois, a water survey, or any state geological survey, or even the USGS state office. If there's natural uranium or, I'll show you an example in a second of beryllium, which I didn't even know was regulated until I started doing some of this work in other states. You can investigate and even online probably find if there's any potential contaminants that might be a problem in an area. So, and those are things just to add. And so some states even have sites to help you. So like here, if you're in Massachusetts, they've got this website, their DEP does. You type in your address and it'll tell you if they're worried about uranium or arsenic in a bedrock well. So if you have a bedrock well, oh, I'm on a timer. No. All right, certainly am. Okay. Boy, I thought I had that problem solved. Anyway, so this is Rhode Island, which is a small state, 25 by 40 miles or so. All the little dots on here are where the state of Rhode Island Department of Health says you need to be concerned about arsenic. And those are because of old orchards where they used to use a lot of arsenic. So the big splotch in the middle, if you can see that, is where there's naturally occurring beryllium I mentioned a minute ago. So it is regulated. It has health effects. It's the only place I know of in the country where there's a lot of beryllium that I've run across. But if you're in Rhode Island and you're in this area, you should definitely test your a well for beryllium to make sure that it's not over some standard, and then find out if it is, how you might treat that. So It's just important to be informed is the bottom line. And this is a really great website developed by Wisconsin DNR and Stevens Point, the University of Stevens Point. This is a GIS map that you can go in and tell it. I told it arsenic by county. Oh, man, it's going to be the rest of the day. I'm sorry. Arsenic by county, and you can see it tells you the levels. The standard is 10, and so it's showing where in a lot of the counties the samples for private wells have been below, but in a few counties they're higher than that. So you can go in. If I'm going to move to Wisconsin, I could go and look at this map and look for different constituents, nitrate, arsenic, whatever, and get an idea if there's something I need to sample for or be concerned with, either because of if it's an agricultural area, probably nitrate, or if it's shallow groundwater and it's a shallow aquifer, that sort of thing. So here's what we suggest. One, we tell everyone you should sample for coliform and nitrate annually. And by themselves, to an adult, coliform and nitrate aren't necessarily harmful, but they're both indicators. They're so ubiquitous, if you will, in our environment that when you find coliform and nitrate, it typically means there's a pathway into your well. They shouldn't be there, and if they are, that means there's some way they got in from the surface. So that's why everyone says sample for coliform and nitrate annually, because if you have those things, it means other things can get in your well from the surface. So that's more man-made constituents and things like that. Or if you're near a feedlot or a septic tank, then you can look at E. coli or other kinds of problems. And we also recommend then kind of doing a general groundwater quality of your well by sampling for all these things that are in the middle here, TDS and arsenic and lead and iron together, and pH. They kind of give you an idea of your general water quality. And if you're in an aquifer that's protected at the surface, groundwater quality doesn't change that rapidly. So it's a good way to understand if there's been a change in your well. So for instance, if your well, the pH in your well has always been 8.02 or near there, so maybe it's 7.9 or 8.1, but it's in that range. If for some reason you sample it every 5 years and it's 6.4, then something's happened. Something's changed. Either there's a contaminant or there's, who knows, but then you can investigate and say, okay, I've never had this issue before. I've never had sulfate in my well, and now all of a sudden I do. What's going on? And work with folks either from a health department or even, like I said, a geological survey or DNR or one of those type of groups who might be able to give you some ideas what's going on. Because chemistry can change when it's affected by things. We even see the earthquakes sometimes affect wells because they shift what's open to a well, whether fractures might be closed or new fractures are formed, and that might change the water quality that way. So, but again, the bottom line is to get advice from your local health department on what you might want to sample for as well. So, inform your client and be informed. There's a lot of resources available for private well owners. They just don't realize it. And you should provide that information. Tell them about our class. And we're not self-serving here. It's really, it's a comprehensive way for a well owner to learn about their well. And, it's what I do for a living as a state employee is when a well owner calls and has a question, I try to answer it and figure out why. And so we put all that knowledge together from the folks here at the survey, and we've developed a class that's really meant to inform well owners and help them understand their responsibilities. Consider if you're, as a realtor, putting information on a web page. Especially if you do a lot of private well work, it's to your benefit to understand all the wells in your area, what type of wells they are, what the common issues are. It'll bring you more business. And that's why I say educate yourself as well as your client. It will show, and people do talk. So, and insist on an inspection and sampling, even if not required. In the end, it far outweighs the costs in what you could learn and what kind of protections you provide your client as you move forward. This is an example for Illinois. Here's the Illinois Department of Public Health's webpage. There's a lot of information over here. On the right side, the Illinois State Geological Survey, Illinois Well Water Interactive Map. You can find your well log right there if you're in Illinois. This is from, again, from Wisconsin, and so there's all kinds of information here for well owners about property transfers. That's the form I showed before. And this is I'm not advocating for any realtor here, but this is a realtor in Colorado who's put together a whole bunch of information on wells, some videos they found from other folks, and information like that. So I've still got this thing forwarding sometimes on me, but that's what I have for the canned part of our talk today. And so we do have a lot of questions that you all asked, and so we're going to start going through those. And again, if you have any questions that I don't answer or anything about what I've said to this point, please use the question box or the chat box and ask your question. And Katie's monitoring that, and we'll be able to get to that at the end. So as we go through these questions, I also have Dan Webb, I mentioned earlier, who is a chemist and runs our public service lab. He's also a private well owner, and so he has a lot of wherewithal related to all those sorts of issues related to water quality and sampling questions and things like that. And so some of these I'm going to answer, and some Dan is, I believe. Okay, so first thing I want to bring up, there's a number of questions about well disinfection, and I used one that we'd been asked before, but the point here is we hear all kinds of different things about when to disinfect a well. Should I do it every month? Should I drop? Some people put I had a well owner in Northern Illinois last fall tell me that his driller told him to just put a cup of bleach down his well every month. That does absolutely nothing to protect his well from bacteria. All it does by putting straight chlorine in is damage his pitless and some of the pieces where they're supposed to come apart. Eventually you do that enough times and it'll all be basically welded together, and you'll end up having to pull the entire pump and pitless and everything else just to get that pump out. So the state of Minnesota, again, they have a lot of wherewithal. That's the bottom line. Their Department of Public Health put together this document, Well and Water System Disinfection for Private Wells. It's what we recommend. And so we looked at probably 50 or more different sets of guidelines on how to disinfect your well, and we chose what we thought was the best one to highlight and to provide to all the well owners who take our class. And it's this one from Minnesota. And if you go on our webpage and look under resources, for each of the 10 lessons, there's a number of resources available that you can click on and download. And this is listed under Lesson 10, under Water Treatment Solutions. And it just says the Minnesota Well Disinfection Guide. And it's great. It shows you how to mix it so that you're mixing it in the proper amount. And it also has information on what to do with your treatment equipment if you have it. And what solution you should mix up based on the depth of your well. It's just got a lot of good instructions with pictures, and as I said, even water treatment equipment on what to do, what to bypass, so you don't mess that stuff up as well. And they recommend going to the Water Quality Association, which is the trade association that represents all the companies that make treatment equipment, where you can find more information on how to protect your treatment equipment if you need to disinfect. But the bottom line is you should only disinfect when you've encountered a problem. So the only time to disinfect your well is when you've had a positive coliform or bacteria hit. You don't do it every year. You don't do it, whenever. Some people say every time you open the well. Well, every time you open the well, you should test your well. Test it for coliform. That's a $15 test. And if it turns out you do have something in your well, then you disinfect it, and I would follow these guidelines. There's certain things you need to do when you disinfect a well. You need to make sure that there's chlorinated water in all the lines, every shower, every toilet, every faucet, and it needs to sit in those lines long enough to disinfect, typically overnight, and this explains how to do all that. So, so that's our take on disinfection, and if you have any questions about any of this stuff, you can always email us too after the fact at info@privatewellclass.org. So another question, can an old well be retrofitted with a new screen? Not really. You can't just put another screen down in there. But it's, if it's a 6-inch well, let's say, and this is the example I used, you do see cases where they may put an entire well within a well, so to speak. So you could put a 4-inch well and screen inside a 6-inch casing and run it all the way to the bottom, and then the water's got to come through that screen in the 4-inch pipe to get in. If there's some problem that's occurred, like the screen's gone bad and it's sand's getting in your well. The problem with that is that if you already have sand getting in your well, then probably the sand is up above the screen already. It's already filled in the well where the screen is, so now you're looking at a little bit shallower well necessarily. Not that that's necessarily a problem, but it's also just doesn't save that much money by the time you get done with it all, and so typically it's better just to put in a new one. And I'm not sure, but there may be laws in some states preventing you doing this as well, and I'd have to look into that. So, yeah. So what, if any, actions can a buyer take if they have problems with their well and septic after purchase? Is there a statute of limitations? This really depends on the state. I already mentioned in Illinois, the seller has to fill out a form saying that they have no issues. They answer yes or no, and that is legally binding. But if you can prove they knew about it, then you can take them to court and they could be liable. But it's really, again, buyer beware. That's what I tell well owners. Don't purchase until you've sampled. Make sure that you're involved or know who did the sampling. I had a well owner who said, yeah, we sampled our well for coliform, and it turned out he had no idea. He didn't even have the results. He just told me it was safe because his realtor did it for him. Well, a realtor shouldn't necessarily be doing the sampling, and maybe some of you do. But in general, I would say that's, yeah, anyway. Also, do your homework. You may be able to find information like we showed earlier on what water quality issues there might be in an area. And so, and if there have been, if you're the buyer, I'd ask the seller, have you had your well tested? If so, can I have a copy of the results? And, if someone's not going to disclose that information, yeah, that's a red flag to me. That's the way we would handle that. But as far as statute of limitations, I think that's going to depend on, the state, the jurisdiction. I know there's different statute of limitations on a lot of different things, so there's really no way for us to know all those rules. Okay, so this question: our church is selling an adjacent property that has the church's well on it. Can we keep the water rights? So I would check with your state agency that regulates well construction code to see what the rules are. In most states, there probably are no rules related to that, but in some there might be. I would think that if there are no rules, you'd need to make it part of the deed of sale, or as a condition of sale, that the church could still use it and will maintain it, and that sort of thing. But we run into problems all the time on a related issue with shared wells, where some states, like Washington State, they actually even regulate any well where there's more than one home on it. So if you have a well that two people are using for two different homes, the state has rules that you have to follow as a shared well. Where in Illinois, there really aren't any rules. We have a colleague here at the Water Survey who lives around about 6 other people, and they all share one well. And I asked her, do you guys have any kind of, is it in your deed, or is it in do you have some kind of contract? What are the rules? What do you guys, what happens when the pump fails? It's $3,000 or $4,000. Who's going to pay for it? They have none of that. And all you're asking for there is a lot of heartache and poor relationships with your neighbors when that happens. So it needs to all be spelled out and, protect yourself legally. So especially if the well's not on your property, you need to make sure that you can still use it. Or, someone may claim, well, that's my well, it's on my property, and I'm just going to cut you off. And that clearly would be a problem. So the other issue that's really important issue for you as a realtor is about water quality testing and what's required. So it's all over the map. New Jersey and several other states now have laws that say that anytime a property is sold a private well, you have to test it. In New Jersey, the state lab comes out and collects a sample, They give the results to the buyer and the seller. At the time that I was learned about this, which is probably 8 or 10 years ago now, it was $600. The buyer and the seller have to decide who's going to pay for it, and the state keeps the information. New Jersey gets about 13,000 samples that way every year. And, as a researcher, what I can say is it'd be awesome to have 13,000 samples of private wells every year so that we could learn more about the water quality of our aquifers. So, it's amazing information to have. But on the other side, that changes property values and all those things. Rhode Island goes a step further. They've tied their required sampling to home inspection, and they can actually condemn a property as unlivable if it fails a water quality test, and then you don't do anything to add treatment to correct that and make it potable water based on certain rules they have. But those are kind of the most stringent, if you will, and in many other states there are no rules, or they're very loose rules, and so that's why you see HUD and lenders have developed their own requirements in an effort to ensure the value of property, really. I mean, why does HUD or why does a mortgage company care about the water quality of a well? Well, if it turns out the well isn't potable, it lowers the property value. Now they've just wrote a loan that, isn't worth what they thought it was. So we see all those things, and they do vary quite a bit. I do want to talk about HUD a little bit. So FHA, VA loans through USDA and the Veterans Administration and HUD, this is what the rules say today. So the first thing, this first part here, is that you must confirm that there's no connection to a public or community water system. If it's feasible at a reasonable cost, you have to forget about the private well, and you have to connect to the community system. That's what their rules say. How stringent or how enforced those are, I have no idea. But they've updated their rules, and I'll show you why in a minute. This is really important because they want people off of private wells. And, from what we see through the private well class and the work we do with private well owners, there literally are many people who have private wells that really have no business being a private well owner. They don't put the time in. They don't understand their well. They have no idea if it's safe or not. They're not. They don't take the responsibility seriously. So first and foremost, if you have the opportunity to connect to community water supply, they say you have to. From that, though, if you do have to have an individual water supply, then what the rules say today are that the water quality has to meet the conditions of the local authority with jurisdiction. That means a local or county health department. But if the local or county or state health department don't have water quality standards for private wells, then this says the water quality must meet the standards set forth by EPA presented in National Primary Drinking Water Regulations. That means that HUD is saying if the county or a local jurisdiction or the state don't have requirements at a property sale for testing, that you have to meet all the same standards that a community water supply does. That would cost several $1,000s to sample for all those things. I don't believe hardly anyone does this. I think it's a problem, and it's something that needs to be addressed eventually about the way HUD's written this rule. Because what's happened instead is there's a lot of misinformation out there and people trying to skirt around those rules. So this list here at the bottom is a PDF that we found on a website for a mortgage company. And a number of people are using this and saying that this is what HUD requires. Lead, nitrate, nitrite, total nitrate, coliforms, and fecal coliform E. coli. This is not the law. This was in a mortgagee letter in 1994, and it was superseded in like 2000. So this hasn't been the rule forever, and yet I know as late as last year there were groundwater groups or folks that support private well owners who are using this form and saying this is what HUD requires and sending letters to a mortgage company or to a bank or whatever in support of a well owner who needed this testing done. So it's not the law. and that's the bottom line. And yet a lot of people are using some of this information as much as if it were. So that's all I'll say on that. Trying to get through to HUD or to any of the other groups, federal agencies that are involved with this issue has been a real struggle. We've tried, and it's kind of, especially since the election, it's kind of fallen flat. And at some point we're trying to get them to consider changing their rules and maybe even developing a committee of folks to come up with something that makes more sense, because people aren't going to spend $2,000 or $3,000 on water samples to get a loan, just the way it is. So bathing versus drinking. I just want to point out, someone asked a question, differing levels of contaminants safe for bathing but not drinking. I would say this is generally true. So, because usually drinking is more of a exposure than having it on your skin, but it's really a contaminant by contaminant issue. And Dan, do you want to add anything here?
Yeah, I don't really have too much to add. I would say you make a pretty good statement here. I don't know much about the skin exposure levels. I usually think of skin as being a pretty good barrier, but of course there are some things that can get through. So I just think of most of the drinking water contaminant regulations being for consumption, like drinking.
Because for arsenic, for instance, the level's 10, but I know they tell people it's okay if it's 40 or 50 or whatever. You don't need a whole house arsenic removal system so that you're not exposed to that in your shower. You just need to make sure you have it on your tap in your kitchen so that your cooking and your drinking water are that lower level. But I'm sure there are other things where that's not the case, and it's just as much of a risk. But again, I left that fairly general because we're not health professionals, and that's who you should ask. And it really is a contaminant by contaminant issue. And I know CDC has a website where they list a lot of the contaminants that are known by CDC, and a lot of that information is available on those sites. So yeah. Okay, so how do I prepare a well to pass inspection? And I just want to point out that, it's really a process of understanding if the well's safe. And so if you know the well is not safe, then you need to mitigate it in advance. So that means adding treatment, bringing the well up to the surface, or even drilling a new well. There are problems that need to be addressed prior to that inspection. So as an example, I have some friends who had an old dug well, and they chlorinated it 3 times before they finally got a sample result that would allow them to sell their farm. And that was, was required by the bank, and it had to pass that test. So basically, if it took that many times, it means that there's a pathway into their well, and they should have added treatment. So whether that's UV or chlorination, they needed to add some kind of continuous disinfection so that that well water could be used. I mean, there's ways around using any water. Matter of fact, I was just at the National Groundwater Association conference last week, and I listened to a talk by a company that's built a complete water reuse system. So it takes your water from that's going out of your house as wastewater, and it runs it through like 5 or 6 different kinds of treatment, and then it's considered safe to drink. And the state of Ohio has just passed a law that allows reuse water to be used for private drinking water. I don't think we're there yet, personally, but that's where we stand as an industry today. So, yeah. So the other part of this is requires testing to determine if there are any concerns. So that's why you should always test your well as a seller, so that you can find out if there's any problems in advance. And especially if you're really trying to sell your house, if someone requires, if I'm the buyer and I'm saying I'm not doing this until I collect a water sample, and then they find something, then all of a sudden you're delaying the whole process and everything else. So it's better to be prepared before you put it on the market. And I left this in from the last presentation we did because I think it's really relevant information. And we had a question kind of similar to this, but not the same one. What we did is Katie actually called a number of drillers just looked them up on the National Groundwater Association site. She picked 5 states and said, what would it cost to drill a 300-foot bedrock well with 6-inch steel casing? And so you can see the differences here. In Michigan, they said 10 to 13K if it's PVC, but over 30K if it's steel, where South Carolina was only 5,700, Missouri was 8,500, where in New Jersey it's 24,000. So we should have done California, because I know especially now that there's the drought they've had over the last 3 or 4 years, there are so many wells that have gone dry that have to be, a new well has to be drilled deeper, that they have like a 6 to 9 month backlog. There's many people out there who their well's gone dry and a driller can't get to them to put in a new well for them for 6 or 9 months. So I'm pretty sure those costs are even higher there. So, it's an issue. It depends on where you live. It's like anything else. It's market demand in a lot of cases. So yeah. How can I safeguard my well from hazards and pollution, and how can I learn more about the pumping and mechanical parts of a well? Well, the first step is to take her class. Like I said, it's 10 lessons. It's not, it's self-paced, so you sign up and it walks you through how water gets into wells, well types, all that information, and it's about 88 pages, I think, total, but it's a really good basic course on private wells. And so all that information's there, and it teaches you how to find information about your well or about a client's well, what how to even look up information in the local logs, like who to contact, things like that. So that's your really first step, and also sample, and then you can ask better questions whenever you go to your local health department or somebody else to ask questions as well. Okay, so Dan, the next couple are yours, I know.
Okay, so a lot of times we do get questions about sulfur smells or rotten egg smells. They do happen quite frequently. Typically, I think those are associated with sulfur-reducing bacteria, and a common way to get rid of that is through chlorination. That can be shock chlorination of the well. Sometimes it may take a few times, and you can try to do that. If it keeps coming back, you may have to, like Steve had mentioned earlier with some other bacteria, you may have to add a continuous chlorination. The chlorination, or you can also use hydrogen peroxide. I don't really have a feel for which is recommended these days. Typically, I think I see chlorination listed. Let's see, what else did I say here? Either of those will also oxidize the gas, and that should reduce the hydrogen sulfide smell too. Sometimes you'll see people talk about a sulfur smell just from a hot water heater.
That's the next question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Basically, you can just go on to that then. Yeah, it's related. Usually it's the same type of explanation. I guess that's where I had mentioned some peroxide. Oh, some other things I've seen people recommend are turning the temperature up, but make sure you turn the temperature back down. The idea there is to kill bacteria in the tank. You do sometimes see people, I think it's an older recommendation, I don't know how often it's made today, but they'll say get rid of your, either just completely remove your anode rod or replace it with a aluminum rod or aluminum zinc rod. I'll read other sites that say that there's just as many smells with those as there are with the magnesium rod. So I would check with your, I don't have a personal experience with which works better, but I would say check with your plumber. I've seen different sites talk about powered anode rods, and they seem like a pretty good suggestion. Don't just remove your anode rod. It's a sacrificial rod. It's there to serve a purpose. I think most hot water tanks are glass lined, but there's still exposures or micro cracks or things like that that can lead to the water going to the metal tank, and you don't want your tank corroding or the fittings that go into your tank corroding. That's what the rod's for. And yeah, I think somebody had asked a question about softeners removing the smells, and they're not generally designed to. In fact, I don't think it comes up very often, but if you do have a softener that's, the resin's bad, it might actually contribute smells. But that I don't think we've covered that before, and I don't really have a lot of experience with that.
Okay. This is yours too?
Okay, yeah, it's a very similar thing. Getting rid of some other, we had a generic question about different types of treatment. Coliform, I would group that in with other, like the sulfur bacteria, other living organisms, typically some type of oxidation, like chlorination or persulfate, or you could use ultraviolet light, like an inline disinfecting system. I think typically shot chlorination is tried first. If you try that, like we said earlier, and it just doesn't go away, then you may have to switch to some continuous treatment. For things like nitrate, dissolved solids, to some extent arsenic, but it really depends on the system. A lot of things can be removed with a reverse osmosis system. That'll get rid of approximately 90% of the dissolved minerals or dissolved content. Those are typically a point of use unit, so you'll put it under your sink. You can buy one for a whole house. We have one here in the lab, but most people are not going to spend several $1,000s on this. If you do have something like coliform nitrate, and Steve might have covered this earlier, but those are like indicating tests that would indicate that you have a likely or potential source from the surface. So instead of just putting on the treatment, it's probably best to start with looking for the problem, like a fault in your casing or a missing brick or such things.
Yeah, because in the end, they really shouldn't be there. So if you can figure out what is the problem, you might avoid actually having to add treatment. So, okay, so what are your thoughts on water quantity testing? So there's a couple things here. One, I know that I believe HUD now requires a 5 gallon per minute for a well. I just read that, and I don't know, I guess you can get a variance from that or whatever, because there's certainly areas where that's not going to be possible. So there's low-yielding bedrock aquifers. We actually have a well we ran across here in Illinois where they had a 1,000-gallon tank in their basement because their well only pumped about 1 gallon a minute. And so it basically ran most of the time so that it could fill that up, and they had a separate pump for it in the basement so that they had water in the morning and the evenings when they needed it. So, there's a lot of issues there, especially in the groundwater industry, about, guaranteeing some kind of water quantity because things change. Even though it depends on when you're sampling. Is it a drought year or a wet year? What kind of aquifer are you in? If it's a shallow well, especially a hand dug or a bored well, in drought years, a lot of times those things can go dry and people haul water. We have an entire area south of Peoria, Illinois, where during the drought in 2012, most of the folks there are on bored wells, and they're all hauling water. And that's just, there's just a lot of issues. So it's more of a ominous thing, if you will, because there's no way to understand exactly, unless there's some really good geology and all the logs are in place where you can really have a qualified geologist or hydrologist look at that information. There's no way to ensure some kind of water quantity availability for a well in most cases. So, and I've listed some things here that are problems. Water levels change throughout the year. And your state geological survey, or in Illinois, the water survey, your best bet to contact someone to give you an idea of if there's been issues. And there's certainly areas of the state where we have no idea. I mean, the whole southern third of Illinois doesn't have any potable water and the groundwater. It's all too saline. It's salt water. And so there's a lot of dug and bored wells in the southern third of the state. And, any year that's dry, they're subject to going dry. So that's the questions that we have for today. We got 15 minutes, and I wanted to talk a little bit about our class and then get to the questions. We have a number of questions that folks have asked here today. The private well class, this is the website, privatewellclass.org, and it has this 10 lessons. It's self-paced. We do webinars like we're doing today. Most of those are for well owners, but we also do them for realtors and labs, environmental health professionals, because those are the folks that are serving well owners the most. And so it's really meant to be a resource. And we've developed some short videos, and we have podcasts, and again, we record all these webinars. So there's 10 lessons. They go all the way from explaining geology and hydrology to talking about contamination and how things like RO works, reverse osmosis units. And so, why does my pump kick on or off all the time? Just a lot of different things that are available through those 10 lessons. This is our website. If you go to privatewellclass.org, you click on the bottom right or bottom left here where it says Learn by Email, and it takes you to this page where you just put in an email address and your first name and what state you live in. And the state part is really so that we can show EPA that we're reaching a national audience. That's all that's used for. And then it sends you one lesson a week for 10 weeks, or so every 7 days. So if you sign up today at 3 o'clock, you'll get an email every Tuesday at 3 o'clock with the next lesson. And it's a PDF. It's about 8 pages long, each one, and it explains, the topic of the day, if you will. We do webinars, as I mentioned. We did one on lead. We've done a few others. We do one on septic systems once a year, and those are recorded. For the lead issue, because it was such a big deal after Flint, and so many people were asking questions, we created a page as well, and I think I have that here. Nope, I don't. I thought I did. But if you go to privatewellclass.org/lead, it'll take you to a page where it's got resources from CDC and EPA and some other sources. And this webinar really explains things from the private well point of view. The Flint lead problem was from a community water supply and service lines. Those premise plumbing issues occur in every house that's more than 20 or 30 years old. So we have a lot of lead solder, and the older the home is, before 1980, you start seeing more lead components. In some states, they allow galvanized pipe, which the galvanizing metal on the outside of a galvanized pipe is lead. It has a lot of lead in it, and so if your water's corrosive, those can be issues. We have these short videos. How does my private well system work? It's a little 5-minute video that explains that. We have one, how does my pressure tank work? It's had like 150,000 hits in a year and a half, I guess closer to 2 years now. We put them up in January of 16, and so, just meant to be a short, on-point topic video of to give well owners an idea of some of the basics. I'd mentioned earlier, like for the disinfection brochure, that it's under Lesson 10. This is Lesson 1 and Lesson 2, the resources that are available under Resource Library, and you can see all of these documents are free and publicly available. So they come from state sources and things like that. As someone who works with well owners, we have a partner resources program. Basically, this is to become an outreach partner. It's really just to get our newsletter. We put out a monthly newsletter that has information that you can share with well owners, things that are going on, classes, things like that. And it's, you take a look, if you scroll down this page, all of our newsletters are listed there. And again, that's under Resource Library, and then the drop down on that has one that says Partner Resources. And you can look at all the past newsletters. So for instance, if you happen to be an environmental health professional, there's a link on one of our newsletters. The National Environmental Health Association has put our class on their website, and sanitarians can take it for CEU credit, and it's also still free, and there's information about some of that sort of stuff too. This is our newsletter. This is the one, newsletter number 2 from February of 16, and this is the one about the NEHA class. And so we also have a website just for realtors with some resources available, and you click on Join Our Partner Community, and it takes you back to the page to add to get our newsletter. But so there's those sorts of resources available. We're trying to provide information that will help you, and so we created those pages. So the goal of our class really is to help well owners understand why their well is important, why they need to understand how it works, and what they can do as a well owner to protect themselves from risk, especially health risks related to contaminants in their well. And so, that's our mission, if you will, and that's what we're after. So we do have a few questions, so don't go anywhere. If you have any comments about this webinar, as it says here, please send us some feedback. But I'm going to slide over the questions that I can figure this out here, make this full screen. Well, I'm struggling. Okay, there we go. And is that large enough? Move that down. There we go. That should be plenty large. So the first question, besides companies selling water treatment systems, who does water well inspections and how to locate them? What's the average cost? You know, if you go back to the webinar we did for realtors in February, that question was asked and we answered it there. So I didn't put it in here again because no one asked this time in the questions that were asked in advance as far as cost, but I believe it ranged from like $200 to $600 for an inspection. But I don't think I would have a water treatment company necessarily do a water well inspection. You know, I would have a licensed well driller or contractor, or there are, you know, professional home inspectors who have training in well inspection. I know one of the home inspection licensing associations contacted us about using our class to help their members learn more about private wells. And so we got them in touch with NEHA, the National Environmental Health Association, and the end of that basically story is that now home inspectors can go on NEHA's website and take our class for free, and it helps them with maintaining their license as a home inspector. So I would just, you know, you can find a professional home inspector or a licensed well driller or contractor, and if you use a home inspector, I would use one that's either taken that class or has some kind of certification saying that they understand private wells. And as far as how to locate them, I have no idea other than, you know, using the internet or the yellow pages. So, yeah. Okay, so Dan, do you recommend a continuous chlorination? Oh, I can answer that too, I guess. Do you recommend a continuous chlorination system? I mean, my take would be only if you need it, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think only if you need it. I don't think a lot of people, the customers we work with, I don't think too many have them, although they're not rare or anything, but it's not like the continuous chlorination system is going to solve the answer for all water treatment. It might solve a bacteria issue, but shot chlorination would hopefully solve that. You may need the continuous chlorination, but if you have a arsenic issue or something, it's not going to do anything for that. So,
well, and I would say that most of the time we hear from well owners that they don't want chlorinated water. You know, they don't like the taste of seawater because it has chlorine in it in some cases. And so, you know, I would say that most people want to avoid that from our experience. That doesn't mean everyone does. But where we see continuous chlorination typically is where it's a shallow well and they keep having bacteria problems, or they know there's some kind of shallow connection, or a spring, you know, like Southern Illinois, Indiana, Tennessee, Kentucky, and actually a lot of other places where folks are using a spring for their water supply. You know, those are too susceptible to bacteria not to use continuous, some kind of disinfection. You see UV too, I guess. Go ahead, Dan. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, that's certainly fine. I was just going to say that it's just another piece of equipment you have to make sure you keep maintained. I don't think we really get into the chlorination or disinfection byproducts, but some people get concerned about those too. It's another reason they may not want continuous chlorination. I don't want to scare anybody off from the continuous chlorination because it's the benefits would outweigh the harm if there is an issue. So,
all right, the third question is for you.
Okay, how do reverse osmosis systems work? Well, there's a membrane in a reverse osmosis system, and that will only typically water will diffuse from a high concentration to water will diffuse into dilute that out. This works under pressure. I don't have the exact mechanics of it, but basically it pushes water through a membrane, and the water can fit through, and many of the other things cannot fit through this membrane. And basically what you end up with is about a 90% reduction in total dissolved minerals. Technically bacteria are big enough they would be removed too. I don't think these are intended to be a primary reduction or prevention of bacteria. I think you'd have to be concerned with the bacteria following the membrane. Often the reverse osmosis systems are put in after a softener also, because I think they'll say the hard water deposits can also foul the membrane. As far as a particular type,
It's really not. Yeah.
yeah, it's not. We don't really recommend a particular type. If it were point of use versus household, I would probably recommend the point of use where you get your drinking water. It's not necessarily unbelievable that you might put one in whole house, but I just don't think that would be applicable for everybody. Also, since it does remove a lot of stuff from your well water, you do change your water chemistry. You take out some of the buffering, or a lot of the buffering capability. You might see problems that you weren't expected too. So I wouldn't really put it on a whole house. I would, if you have some major problem, I would look for a different solution first.
Okay. So as far as this last question here, can you go back to that second screen about rotten egg smell, please? Well, I mean, I guess I can go back, but we do record this. It'll be on our website. And I guess if this is the last question, I will go back for you because we are done for the day, and I'll leave that up if you want to hang on. So I'm going to put this up here. If you happen to need continuing education for this, and it, usually that's for environmental health professionals, contact us. And if anything else, there's our email address, info@privatewellclass.org. But I want to thank everybody for attending and thank Katie and Dan for participating. And I will pull that up now so that you can see that slide. And there we go. Let me go backwards here. I can. I think I'm going to assume it's this one. Said the second one, right? Okay. So thank you very much. And I'm going to let this sit here for just a minute, and then I'm going to kill the webinar. So thanks for attending.